Welcome back everyone. Let's go ahead and take a look at the LG G8 and see how this phone holds up in 2022. Now what's very sad is that since this phone, actually came out, LG kind of mentioned they're kind of seizing their phone department, so it doesn't look like they're going to be making phones anymore, although they still might. I mean, there's been some rumors that they're going to start making phones again. I don't know why. But I will say LG had a really decent run for several different devices that they had. I think the LG G2 was a really cool phone. I used that phone for about a year and a half, and I loved that phone a lot, and I feel like ever since then they've kind of taken some really weird approaches. I think the LG G3 was one of the coolest phones they made, but most of their phones had this boot looping issue, and it seemed like they kind of just went for this, kind of like escapade of like trying to be like this weird different type of device. They inputted like 1440p displays on the G3, and that phone came out many years ago. The G4 was a decent phone, then the G5 came out, and that totally butchered everything. I don't know why they went that route. I think the G6 was a decent phone, the G7 was a decent phone, and then the G8 was kind of like the last phones they kind of ever made that was like a flagship of a flagship. Now with this phone, I wouldn't really recommend buying it anymore, mostly due to the fact that the people who've made this phone are now no longer with us pretty much. So if you want to pick up a Samsung or a Google Pixel, I'll leave some links in the description. You can get them from there and help support the channel at the same time. Now starting off with the outside of the LG G8, on the front, we had a 6.1-inch POLED display. It was a 1440p panel, and I actually do think it was it was a pretty good screen for the most part. This time around, in 2019, we had the Samsung Galaxy S10s and the iPhone 11s that came out this year, and definitely the Galaxy S10 had the best panel that year, even though the 7 Pro, OnePlus 7 Pro had a really good panel too. I would say the G8's panel was actually pretty decent. I think the notch was a little weird. I don't know, it kind of like grew on me a little bit, but after looking at phones like the Galaxy S10 with its hole punch display and the OnePlus 7 Pro with its non-hole punch display with just the whole entire display, it's hard to look at the G8 and be like, oh, like this was the phone I want or whatever, but this phone actually had some pretty cool capability. First of all, it had a USB Type-C port, which most other phones had nowadays, but the audio quality apparently from the LG G8 was apparently some of the best audio quality of all time, and this is something that was noted to me a little bit after I've actually used this phone, and I will definitely tell you that's probably a really cool thing about this device. If you're somebody who's really into audio, this is a really good phone for that. On top of that, you also had a micro SD card slot, which could be rivaled against like some of those OnePlus phones that did not have a micro SD card slot. So I think that's a really cool thing about this phone too. On top of that, you had the full glass back, which still looks really good. Definitely does not look ugly. You had the fingerprint sensor on the back, and then you had the camera setup, which looked like it was a different camera setup depending on which model you bought, which was very interesting. You had IP certification on this phone too, and overall, when I'm still like feeling this phone, it has a good heft to it. It does not feel like a cheap phone at all, and I definitely do think, for the looks aspect, it definitely looked good. It doesn't look like an ugly phone by any means. Now, I will definitely tell you, with the whole entire setup with the camera, a very interesting approach from LG. So on the back, we had a dual camera setup or a triple camera setup, depending on which model you had. So it looks like some models had, that 12 megapixel standard lens, then a 16 megapixel ultra-wide sensor, and some other ones had a 12 megapixel standard, 16 megapixel ultra-wide, and then a 12 megapixel telephoto lens. Now, this specific camera setup on the back is pretty decent, 4K at 60, which is really cool. And I will say, even though these specific phones sometimes don't lend themselves too well in like other applications like Snapchat and TikTok and Instagram nowadays, I don't think this is a bad camera, and I do think it's actually a decent camera. LG made some really good cameras in that G2 and G3 era, possibly even the G4, but I would say with this type of phone, I would put it on the tailor end, like definitely higher end devices when it came down to it. The front camera though, very strange approach from LG. 8 megapixel sensor is a wide angle lens. Now it was a 1080p sensor on the front. I feel like LG at that time could have done a little bit better, to be completely honest. Having 4K 60 on the front is super important, and they couldn't really do that in this specific case. I don't know why. Majority of the other 2019 phones had 4K at 60 except OnePlus, so it's really weird that LG didn't go through the in this specific case, but it is what it is. There's really not much we can do about it anymore. But I will definitely tell you, when it comes down to it, the camera setup on this thing, definitely more of a pro than a con, and it definitely gets a thumbs up for me for sure, at least nowadays. Now moving on to the software side of things, This thing, I guess, came out with Android 9, which was Android Pie, which is crazy because back in 2019, I guess that was one of the more recent versions of Android, not the latest. It did, I guess, stop at Android 10 or Android 11. From what I'm seeing, I'm kind of getting a mixed response. So I will definitely tell you, regardless if it stopped at Android 10 or Android 11 or beyond, it's still an outdated device because the phone manufacturer is pretty much going out of business. So because because of that, we're stuck in a situation that even if this phone was up to date on the most recent version of Android right now, there's really not too much of a future ahead of it because the company that made this phone isn't really around anymore. I mean, still around, but they're not making phones. But the other problem is that they don't really need to go ahead and update their older phones anymore because they kind of already seized their business. So there isn't really this big, push for them to go ahead and say, hey, let's go and push more features to this device. Let's go and do X, Y, and Z, because there's really no point in doing that because they just, are already out of business. So because of that, it doesn't really make too much sense for them to go ahead and just, be incentivized to keep continuing to push updates for these devices. So because of that, we're stuck in a situation where, the software side of things, it just isn't really that good of a look on this phone anymore. And I would probably recommend going for like a Google Pixel or something. I mean, the Pixel 4 that came out in 2019 as well, I would highly recommend buying that phone over this thing as well. And probably that phone is probably cheaper in some areas too. So in terms of that, that's kind of how I would kind of consider the, software side of things. Now the performance side is actually very interesting. So it had that Qualcomm Snapdragon 855 chipset inside of it with 6 gigabytes of RAM. There was only one model of this phone. And what's very, very interesting about the G8 was that this device was one of the first phones that came out in 2019 with that latest generation of Snapdragon chipsets. I think it was around this time too the Galaxy S10s came out. And that was another thing that LG did. They kind of matched their lineup with the release phones of these specific devices with the Samsungs, the Galaxy S10 that came out this year. And with that phone was so crazy good. So they were kind of competing with that phone and that whole entire release of devices, which was so crazy. And I'm not too sure why, LG even chose that direction. But I think the performance side of things is okay in this day and age. I don't think it's necessarily the first device I would recommend anybody to buy anymore. But if it's a device that's, kind of in the performance side of things, I think it's definitely one of its better areas. I think the camera is up there too, but I think the performance is more of a plus than a con. I'm not a fan of LG's UI, whatever they used to call it. I don't think it was a smart, approach from them. I think, around that G2, G3 era, that was probably their top tier era at that time. And since then, they kind of made some really strange, UIs. And I think a UI really makes the device. You look at OnePlus and you look at Oxygen OS, they are known for that specific software. You look at, even the Samsungs, they're known for One UI, and there's a lot of people who like it. With the G8, I don't think there was like a crazy amount of people that like that specific software. And that's why these specific devices never really caught on the way that LG was trying to get them to catch on. So it kind of puts this phone in a weird sector of performance. I think it's a good performing phone. The UI is kind of clunky. It's not my first phone I would recommend people to buy, especially from a performance standpoint. And even though I would say the Galaxy S10 of that time that came out, I think with Android 9 or something like that, even though this phone may have not had the best version of Android, it still could have been a little bit better in the software performance standpoint, in my opinion. So in terms of that kind of covers it up in the performance segment. Now ending it off with the battery life, this thing actually had a pretty decent sized battery. It was a 3500 mAh, which kind of put it in line with something like a Galaxy S10, which is really cool. But again, if they wanted to go ahead and compete with something like the Samsung Galaxy S10 Plus or the iPhone 11s, I think they had to go ahead and kind of switch it up a little bit. And I think ultimately when it comes down to it, the LG G8 is a very interesting device. I feel like LG could have done a little tiny bit better with this device, but even if this phone wasn't a bad phone, but they just put it, they released it at the same time almost as the Galaxy S10s, and those were arguably one of the best phones that came out that year. They did very little marketing with this phone, at least as far as I can tell, and there just wasn't really that big of a hype train behind this device. They never really gave us too many crazy, flagship phones after this. Their V lineup was really cool. I kind of like those phones a lot, but the G8 I think in 2022 isn't really worth it when you consider, all the 2019 phones and how great of a job those manufacturers did with those phones and how that kind of put the G8 in a little bit of a different, area. So that kind of covers it up. If you have any other questions or anything, let me know in the comment section below. Hit the like button, that would mean so much, but definitely hit that subscribe button. More importantly than everything else, I love every single one of you guys. Hopefully I'll catch you guys in the next video. Peace out till then.